Ukraine top of the agenda. Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has backed a call by Kiev to send more air defense systems to the country.
I welcome that NATO allies are providing air defense systems. That is extremely important. And I welcome the recent announcement by Germany and also the delivery of German air defense systems to Ukraine. And I think we all have seen why this is important. The horrific, the indiscriminate attacks against Ukrainian cities, civilian killed, civilian critical infrastructure destroyed, and not least the attacks on the energy system, the energy infrastructure, is serious as we approach winter. So all of this demonstrates the urgent need for more air defense for Ukraine.
All right, let's go over now live to Natasha Butler. She's in Brussels for us. So, Natasha, where are they heading on the issue of air defense system supplies for Ukraine?
Well, it's certainly one of the things they'll be talking about today, because what NATO defence ministers are really looking at is how can they best support Ukraine as this war continues. Now, there will be today a meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. That is a group that was set up earlier this year by the United States. It meets relatively regularly. There are some 50 countries that are part of it, and they are looking at how to keep up, for example, things like weapons supplies to Ukraine, something that Kyiv has asked for repeatedly. On Monday, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that his #1 priority right now was an air defense shield. He is looking for more air defense missile systems to be sent to Ukraine to help protect the populations there. We know, and you heard there from Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, that Germany is looking at sending such defense missile systems. We know as well the US is looking at doing the same. But of course, defense ministers will be looking at what sort of other help they can provide in terms of weapons and ammunitions, but also things like training, because of course, as you're sending some of this new, more advanced technology into Ukraine, the soldiers, the forces there have to be trained in how to best use it. Another thing that is likely to come up is this question of stocks, because of course, as NATO member states are sending some of their weapons, their supplies, their ammunitions to Ukraine, their own stocks are dwindling of weapons, and there's been talk about whether or not NATO defence ministers look at if they can be working more closely with industry in their own countries to try and ramp up production.
And some officials really underscoring that NATO is not part of this conflict. Why, Natasha?
Something that Jens Stoltenberg said in his opening remarks, his opening press conference here. He said that it is very important to understand that NATO is not a part of this conflict, even though the alliance will continue very much to support Ukraine until the end, for however long it takes. He said, look, it's from NATO's point of view, what they're trying to say is, look, we are supporting Ukraine, we're continuing to send these weapons, but as long as they don't have soldiers or forces on the ground, they are not actually fighting Russia directly. Now, NATO's always made it very clear that they have no reason to send troops on the ground to Ukraine. Ukraine is not a NATO member, but there's also an awareness, of course, amongst NATO member states that Russia could perceive the sending of this more advanced technology as these weapons keep flowing to Ukraine, that Russia could perceive that as NATO in some way being more involved than it should, and that could mean an escalation in tensions, something, of course, NATO wants to avoid. However, Jens Stoltenberg did make the point on Monday, and this was a point also made by the heads of the G7 who also met on Monday, that any attack or any disruption to Western infrastructure that could be questionable would receive a very strict and tough response.
All right, thanks so much, Natasha Butler. Now, Poland says it's detected a leak in the Druzhba oil pipeline, the world's largest. It runs from eastern Russia, branching out across Europe. Polish authorities say the leak was likely caused by an accident. It's in a line about 70 kilometers from the Polish city Plock. EU energy ministers are meeting in Prague to find ways to tackle high gas prices. 15 members of the European Union want the price of wholesale gas to be capped across the bloc. They don't want richer countries in Europe to be able to buy gas at higher prices. The group argues the cap would help curb prices before expensive gas supplies enter the market, reach power plants and drive up electricity bills. The proposal is based on 3 ideas: setting a limit on the cost of Russian gas imports, negotiating a lower gas price with other suppliers, and establishing a ceiling on the price of gas used to generate electricity. Some EU member states disagree with that plan. They want alternative options, including a limit on gas consumption and subsidy packages for businesses and consumers. Step Vassen is at that meeting in Prague and joins us now live from there. So are they heading for an agreement on gas price capping?
Well, if I'm listening to the statements this morning, that agreement is still very far on a price cap. There is simply still a lot of resistance from Germany and the Netherlands. Specifically, they say this plan that is now floating around, that's also been explained by the Czech presidency of the EU right now, this price cap on gas for electricity, which is basically quite a modest version of a price cap, which was initially suggested to have a cap on the whole gas buying, all the supply of gas. But this is only gas for electricity, which is really hurting households around Europe. So the plan is to put a maximum price on that. And it's been tried in Spain and Portugal since June. But what happened is that even though the price went down around 25%, consumption went up. And this is the main concern for the Netherlands and Germany. They're really pushing to keep consumption low because they're seriously worried about blackouts. And this is what the State Secretary for Economic Affairs of Germany had to say this morning.
We need to finally step up and implement the common purchasing of gas. We need to speak to our partner countries which supply Europe with gas in order to help bringing down the excessively high prices. We have to coordinate our demand reduction measures even more. And in particular, we understand now much better how the spot market price for gas is influencing all the contracts, and we are confident that it is possible to find common ways to reduce prices, but at the same time to avoid rationing and to ensure that still market forces are in place to help us limiting demand.
So the Netherlands and Germany has now launched this 10-point measurement package that they called a no-regret action package, which basically focuses on a joint buying efforts by the EU nations, so a collective buying so they don't compete among each other. This is something that the more richer countries in Europe really have been focusing on. They really want the producers to lower their prices and not the states, the countries, to have to dig in to their budgets, their state budgets, to compensate consumers and the people in their countries for the high gas prices. So they really want to buy less and so to pay less. And this is something that the Netherlands and Germany is really pushing for at today's meeting. They also want this bench price for LNG, but it's apparently a voluntary price mark, so a benchmark. So it's still, there's a lot of questions there. So if there's a price cap at the end of this day, there's still a lot of doubts about that.
All right, thanks so much. Step Vassen there. People in France are struggling to buy petrol as refinery and storage workers hold a strike. Staff at oil giants Total Energies and ExxonMobil have walked off the job, demanding pay rises. The French government is ordering some to return to their sites, but it's being defied. Now, plenty more still ahead on the News Hour, including hundreds dead and homes underwater. Nigeria struggles to cope with the worst flooding it's seen in a decade. Plus,
I'm Emily Angwin in South Africa, where rhino numbers are at dire levels and conservationists are calling for a radical shift in the approach to the illegal wildlife trade before it's too late.
And in sport, Ukraine's baseball team swing into New York for a visit. Faras here with that story. The US president says there'll be consequences for Riyadh after the OPEC Plus group led by Saudi Arabia decided to steeply cut oil production. The Organization of Petrol Exporting Countries announced its decision last week, despite US opposition. The White House says President Joe Biden is willing to work with Congress. That's after a senior senator called for a freeze on cooperation with Saudi Arabia.
From the beginning of the administration, since taking office, the president has been very clear that the United States needs a different sort of relationship with Saudi Arabia. He has said that from very early on. And I have said this last week when OPEC made the decision to align their energy policy with Russia's war aims and against the American people, further underscores that reasoning to realign that relationship, to reevaluate that relationship with Saudi Arabia. We are reviewing where we are currently right now, and we'll be watching closely over the coming weeks and months as well.
Well, Kimberly Halkett has more from the White House.
Well, this is something that has really been a concern for many on Capitol Hill for some time, this U.S.-Saudi relationship. And there has been concern about particularly the issue of human rights. And so this is something that many members of Congress, not just from the opposition Republican Party, but also from the president's own Democratic Party, have been urging the White House to do, not just the Biden administration, but also the Trump administration for many years, to reevaluate this relationship. And so this is something that, as we've been reporting, the national security spokesperson John Kirby says is now something that the White House is willing to look at, given the fact that the president did travel to Saudi Arabia in recent months, did feel that he had a good conversation with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, but they're not happy with the fact that now there has this decision by OPEC to, in fact, cut production. And so there's a number of reasons why the White House is not happy about this decision. And one of the big reasons is that there is a congressional election that is coming up in just a matter of weeks, in fact, in November. And this is really seen to benefit the president's political adversaries here in the United States. High energy prices really are not good for the president politically. And so that's one reason that this White House is not happy about this. But the other reason that the White House is not happy about this is that the fact that this is really seen as aligning with Russia.
Let's bring in now Marwan Kabalan. He's the head of political studies at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Joins us now from Doha. Good to have you with us. So first of all, is the Biden administration, do you think, really angry with the Saudis, or is this talk of reevaluating the relationship, the talk of consequences, is it really just about domestic consumption? So Biden looks tough ahead of elections.
Well, I think they might be angry because, the Biden administration tries to interpret the Saudi decision as, on the one hand, sort of a realignment by the Saudis, or an alignment by the Saudis with the Russians on the Ukrainian war, because the Saudis have not been willing over the past few months actually to denounce the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or to give a clear stand on the war on Ukraine. Rather, they have taken a neutral position on that, and they have actually stood by their alliance with the Russians in OPEC. Because, there has been an agreement between OPEC and the Russians in 2020 to cut down oil productions because the prices, because of COVID-19, have plummeted in 2020, and they remain actually very much faithful to that agreement. On the other hand, also, the Biden administration interpreted the Saudi decision as an attempt maybe to influence the midterm elections. Saudi-U.S. relations have not been really warm over the past 2 years since the Biden administration came to power in early 2021. President Biden has made many comments actually that angered the Saudis. Of course, the Saudis are saying that the decision has been actually based mainly on economic grounds.
Yeah, before we get that, Marwan, can I ask you this question? What options does the White House have then if it wants to hit back at Saudi Arabia without undermining its own interests in the region?
Yeah, this is a very good question, Sami, because one reason for the Biden visit to Saudi Arabia last summer actually was to prevent the Saudis from drifting towards China and Russia. This is something that is worrying the United States a lot in these days. So they might be using force. I mean, the Americans, they have leverage over the Saudis. They can use many tools actually to put pressure on the Saudis, like, for example, stop their arms deals for the Saudis, whom they need these arms very much because of the war in Yemen, and because they are facing also threats from different places by Iran and by its proxies.
Right.
Well, on the other hand, as you said, I mean, the Biden administration must strike a balance between the domestic needs on one hand, the pressure by the Congress in order to do something against the Saudis, but on the other hand, they don't want to go very far in that, so that they push the Saudis to the lap of the Chinese and the Russians.
That would undermine their own interests, obviously. Right, let me ask you this question, though.
Absolutely.
Is Saudi Arabia really siding with Russia, or is it siding with its own interests in supporting OPEC oil cuts? Because when you look at the data, oil prices, at least the Brent blend, they were actually dropping since mid-July. About mid-July, they were, around $110 a barrel to 84. That was going down, $84 a barrel before OPEC cut the prices. So was this really Saudi Arabia siding with Russia, or it just wanted to keep the oil prices high? It was a pragmatic move.
It's, as you said, Sami, I mean, I don't believe that the Saudis, they want actually to align themselves with Russia, especially now Russia in a pretty weak position right now, and Russia cannot actually compensate for the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, they still need the Americans very much as a strong security ally in the midst of so many challenges. I think the decision by the Saudis have taken completely based on economic grounds. As you said, I mean, the oil prices have been plummeting over the past few months, and the Saudis, they need the money. Actually, they need to keep the price as high as possible because they need that money. They have so many schemes and projects in the kingdom, so they need all sorts of cash in order to keep that going. So I don't believe that the interpretation by the Biden administration that the Saudis are aligning themselves with the Russians to be the accurate description of the latest Saudi decision. Plus, this is not the Saudi decision only. This is a decision by OPEC and by other oil-producing countries. All they need higher prices for oil, especially at this particular time.
All right, Marwan, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your analysis on that. Now, Nigeria is battling some of its worst floods in a decade. Heavy rain has affected the south for weeks now. More than 300 people have died. Stephanie Decker reports.
Roads, gardens, homes, all submerged. In some cases, the floodwaters have reached as high as the rooftops.
We are left with nothing to cope with life. We now get into the first floors of our houses in canoes. I don't know how we're going to get back from what's lost from the flood. We don't have anything to eat.
Nigeria has been battling heavy rains and catastrophic flooding for weeks. More than 500,000 people have been affected, according to the National Emergency Management Agency.
We were not properly informed on the magnitude of what we will face because if they did, we would have had made plans to evacuate. We thought it was the normal